Hello, friends of the European spirit. Today I'm going to discuss Schelling's notion of monotheism and why Schelling thinks monotheism to be superior. Schelling follows Cudworth in believing that monotheism comes first, not as a concept, but as, let's say, the idea. The concept, of course, comes much later. And that after monotheism, what we now refer to as monotheism, polytheism comes out of monotheism. So it's the reversal, as it were, of what we perhaps usually might assume, that it's first polytheism followed by monotheism. But for Schelling, polytheism is not, importantly, a degeneration, but actually it complements monotheism. And for Hume, David Hume, that would be quite different. It's actually in opposition to Cudworth. Hume speaks of an oscillation between the two, between monotheism and polytheism, with Hume, of course, preferring polytheism because it's open to other gods. And Schelling would actually believe the opposite, that it's monotheism that allows for some sort of polytheism that actually allows for more of a dialogue, let's say. But I would side with David Hume, I have to say. If you read, for example, Jan Assmann's book on Moses, you find that the notion of a jealous God who claims and whose followers claim that he is the only God leads to a deterioration of the dialogue between tribes and peoples. Now, for Schelling, just to mention this briefly, nature is a manifestation of spirit and is hence not neutral. But mythology also is a manifestation of spirit for Schelling. So nature and myth, they belong together. Monotheism for Schelling is, however, quite different from how Assmann would understand the Mosaic revolution, insofar as for Schelling, monotheism allows for and includes plurality. And this is where Schelling wants to arrive. Theism, according to Schelling, cannot allow for that. So it must be monotheism. One could, of course, ask the question, something you could think about, is not monotheism too rigid? Would it not be better to go with theism? And by the way, if you're interested in learning more about Schelling and German idealism more broadly speaking, beginning with Kant, going to Fichte, Hölderlin, Schelling, and of course Hegel, follow the link in the description of this video to my course on German idealism. In the Schelling lecture, I focus on his notion of learning in order to create, which we find in his lecture course and his lectures on university studies. And I also focus mainly on his essay on freedom. Now, again, just to repeat this, monotheism as a belief or as a practice also is older than the concept monotheism. Language, culture, religion, nationhood emerge out of historical logos for Schelling. Mythos and logos in Schelling really come together. He is the first, I would say, philosopher of mythology who takes mythology seriously again. But the question remains, why this turn to monotheism? Why this need for the one God that then gives rise to a polytheism, or let's say at least plurality? A plurality of gods, but ultimately tied up with God. Now, one could say that Schelling is a sort of Neoplatonist, etc. Hence, that's where his leanings are, but that wouldn't be enough. That was a sort of an external assessment would be, as it were, correct. But what we need to understand is why Schelling, in the way he thinks, needs to, in some sense, really postulate the one God, as it were, in the beginning. Now with Schelling, and I won't go into too much detail here, but with Schelling's notion of das Unvordenkliche, the unprethinkable or the immemorial, that which cannot be remembered, that which thought cannot get behind, really means a split or an eremption between essence and existence. Or simply put, between the universal, the general, and the particular. And thus, philosophies or theories that have this approach need a principle of individuation. So, think of Schopenhauer, think of Spinoza as examples. Schelling also requires a principle of individuation for plurality, because in his thinking, what happens is that essence and existence fall apart. So something exists, but its essence is sort of derempted from that which exists. And hence, there must be the presupposition, what must be presupposed is a principle of individuation, and that is the monotheos. Theism isn't radical enough to guarantee the instantiation or the individuation, the potential of individuation of the plurality. That's how I understand Schelling. And I'd be interested to hear what you think. So Geschichte proper or history proper for Schelling begins with the banishing of Saturn and the Titans. But the gods stay with us. So it is when monotheism is allowed to shine forth as the primordial source that it is, that Geschichte or history proper begins. And so I would say the following. Schelling, and this is in his obscure text, I say obscure because it's not really available, on monotheism. I think that Schelling postulates monotheism and all sorts of representations of it and associations that come with it. He presupposes it, but also posits it, as he often does, as the goal of history. The highest form of monotheism is Christianity because of Trinity for Schelling. So the Trinity includes the potential for plurality. Hence, Christianity is true monotheism. That's how you have to understand this. So there's a thought of unity, of course. Trinity is not one and then one and then one, or 1, 2, 3. There's a unity in and of the three. The new monotheism, which Schelling propagates, which he advocates for, the highest monotheism, as it were, which shall be reached, and this is something he wants to work towards, is such in which, that's how I understand him at least, that which is trans-temporal, überzeitlich, and that which is temporal, that which is historical, that which is trans or super-historical, are united or unified in such a manner that history doesn't end and is not sublated, but instead there's a unification of those levels, of those layers, not just a unification, but there's a harmonization of them, so that they gloriously evermore, this is now my interpretation of course, forevermore in a reconciled manner progress together. A progress, without value-free progress is simply to mean voranschreiten, to progredere, to march on together. That's how I would summarize briefly at least, Schelling's notion of monotheism, why he turns to monotheism, again, why he has to turn to monotheism, because he requires a principle of individuation in his thinking, because he always presupposes the unthinkable, and how he sees monotheism as superior to polytheism, because polytheism ultimately is granted by or allowed for by monotheism. So thank you very much again for listening. And I do have to say, if you like this video, do subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and also do consider buying a course at my Halcyon Academy. One of the ones that would make the most sense if you're interested in Schelling is, of course, my course on German idealism. Link in the description of this video. Thank you.